Hello? Hello. Hi, everybody. How's it going? Welcome to the live stream. I'm very excited about this story today. So, let's see. Oh, we're doing some predictions in the chat. It looks like fun, good times. Good. Just yeah, go ahead and do predictions in the chat if that's what you're feeling. You're feeling it. I don't know if you can hear my laptop. It's whirring. It's going crazy. I don't know what's happening. This is gonna get in my way. Don't mind me. Just moving some stuff around. Okay. Oh, we're talking about Cedric again in the chat. That's fun. How are you? How am I? How is everyone? Yes, I am at home all day. I'm at home all day, every day, working on podcast stuff and watching TV and reading books and crafting, and it's fine. It's fine. I'm fine. Quarantine is doing something weird to me, and my hair's getting poofy. Why do we have to listen to Taylor Swift now? What's happening in the chat here? I'm very confused. Good. Let's see. Let's make sure no one's having a hard time getting here because I want everyone to be here for this magnificent story experience. Oh, I didn't know this title was the name of a Taylor Swift song. You learn something new every day. I don't actually listen to Taylor Swift very much, so excellent. Lockhart / Snape. Who do you think I am, Kim? Lol. You see, it is the Swift cast, but also, do either of us know anything about Taylor Swift? I did watch Taylor Swift's documentary on Netflix, actually. It was good. I liked it. It made me like Taylor Swift. I don't know. I have a lot of opinions. I actually could do a Swift cast just with like random opinions, but I don't actually know very many Taylor Swift songs that aren't off that Nutso album. So this is a lot of people's first live stream. That's very exciting. I'm really excited that this is the story that you get to join us for because it's beautiful. I have to keep my water next to me. I feel like I sound like this. I sound funky because it's quarantine days. So like when my roommates are working, I don't really talk. So I gotta talk a little bit first to get it because I'm a little bit, it sounds like I've been asleep because I've been talking all day yet. So hydrate or dihydrate. That's true. Thank you. The last live stream Colin did, and it was in the evening. So he was drinking some beer. And this is clearly the afternoon, like very much it's noon. It's a little early. Plus, I don't have any beer. I can't drink beer because it makes me sick. I just have wine, and like, you can't have wine at noon. I don't think you can have wine at noon. Excellent. Ooh, this is a good turnout. It's a good turnout, folks. Also, my nails are getting super long. Ooh, we're all gonna come out of quarantine looking fresh to death, you guys. Yeah. Hopefully soon. I don't know. Kim still has a pretty busy schedule, and I am unemployed now. So really, it's gonna be mostly me just because I'm the one that has the time on my hands. But I really do hope Colin's gonna do a couple more and Kim will do some when she's got some time for it. So um all right. Well, it looks like it's about time to get started. We'll go ahead and get started. Oh no, the unemployed party. Uh, uh, it's sort of like a dancing, but with a facial expression of existential dread. Uh, Excellent, good. Whew. All right. I'm going to read a story to you now. I'm going to read a fan fiction to you today. This is the longest one we've done so far. So settle in, let's get somewhere comfy, little blanket, and it's time for story time. All right. This fan fiction is called "I Forgot That You Existed," and it is by Sherlockian 1895. So here we go. I'm so excited. I love this story. um, here we are. I forgot that you existed. When Mad Eye had mentioned that the Order of the Phoenix's headquarters were a little rough around the edges, she had taken it to mean perhaps not located in the best part of town. But Nymphadora Tonks realized after tripping over a severed troll leg umbrella stand, landing on a rug that had tracked more grime than even Mad Eye Moody's boots, and waking up an extremely foul portrait of her great something or other, rough around the edges didn't even begin to cover it. After being peeled off the floor by a tisking Molly Weasley, she had been whisked away towards what she presumed to be the kitchen, only briefly catching a glance of the truly repulsive house elf heads that had been hung along the staircase wall. Crossing the threshold into the kitchen, Tonks was hit with a wall of hot, humid air. The room was already crowded, the chairs located around the table claimed long ago, and she found herself inching along the perimeter, eventually gaining a half-yard space behind a seat occupied by Minerva McGonagall, and next to a tall man she didn't recognize. It seemed Dumbledore had already called the meeting to order before she had arrived, as he was in the middle of a presentation on fudge and the ministry. Damn Mad Eye and his constant vigilance, she muttered under her breath. They would have arrived on time had he not felt the need to inspect the muggle neighbor's trash awaiting to be picked up the next morning. Could be spies, you know, he'd insisted. Constant vigilance. Dustbins again? The man next to her whispered above her ear. Something like that, she replied, before realizing she'd said her previous thoughts aloud and that the stranger at her side apparently knew what she was talking about. Tonks risked a sideways glance in his direction and managed to make out the smallest of smirks and a glint of amusement in his eyes. Git, she thought as she folded her arms around her chest, trying to pay attention to Dumbledore's words. Talk circled around Fudge and his denial of Voldemort's return, but somewhere between Molly's attempts to recruit cleaning volunteers and Mundungus Fletcher arguing about whether or not anything Molly deemed junk he could get his hands on, Tonks found her eyes roaming around the room, inventorying those she did and did not know. Her gaze first landed on Kingsley Shacklebolt and Sturgis Podmore, both her co-workers, paying rapt attention to Dumbledore, if only because their participation in the discussion seemed imminent. Against the wall behind them stood a gaunt, dark-haired man, who she only presumed was Sirius. The last time she'd seen her cousin, she'd only been 8 or 9, and he was in his early 20s, but the man she saw now looked older than he ought to be at this point. Two women she didn't recognize were seated next to Molly and Arthur, and across from them were two older men, identities also unknown. A dark figure she recognized as her former greasy-haired potions professor stood in the corner opposite Sirius, and seemed to be giving most of his attention to glaring at the escaped convict. Bill Weasley, seemingly against his will, was stood next to Snape. He gave Tonks an amused look as Mad Eye started ranting about the lack of security in certain ministry departments. Tonks rolled her eyes and returned. This was mild. Before she knew it, people were rising from their seats and making a beeline for the stove, where two pots of whatever delicious thing Molly had cooked up tonight simmered busily. Tonks barely had time to unstick herself from the wall. Really, could no one open a window? Before she was enveloped in a crushing hug. My favorite cousin! A warm voice exclaimed loudly in her ear. Sirius! She gasped, her lungs constricting in his tight embrace. He pulled away for a moment, resting his hands on her shoulders. Well, you're certainly a lot taller than the last time I saw you, he grinned, returning his arms to his sides. Remember when this pipsqueak thought she could take James and I at Quidditch, Moony? If I remember correctly, she managed to put up a pretty good fight against two grown men. Tonks suddenly realized that the voice replying was the one who had whispered in her ear earlier. How would he have any idea what... Prongs and I went easy on her. Otherwise, Andy would have had my head. How's your mother anyways? Still as unabashedly disgusted with her family, I hope? Tonks let out a puff of laughter. Disgusted was putting it lightly. Let's just say, however happy she would be to know I was here for the order, I think she might keel over to know I was, well, here. She gestured around the room. I don't think she ever really believed it, that her favorite cousin was actually a mass murderer. Sirius gave her a gracious smile. And if I remember correctly, you and James spent the entire time arguing about which of you should do what, that neither of you paid me any mind while I kept scoring. The thought of her mother knowing she was currently in the ancestral home of the most noble and ancient House of Black, though amusing, had momentarily distracted Tonks from the previous issue at hand. She turned her attention from Sirius to the man beside her. I'm sorry, I don't... Remus Lupin. Unfortunate lifelong friend of Sirius Black and apparently unmemorable to young children. Long fingers clasped around her hand as she finally looked at him fully. Hazel eyes flecked with gold were framed by slightly graying light brown hair and two thin scars that traversed his face. Despite the extremely uncomfortable temperature, he was dressed in light brown trousers and a blue buttoned shirt. Unmemorable? Who was he? The corners of his mouth twitched upward as he released her hand. Pleasure to meet you once again, Nymphadora. Once again? Don't call me. You three better come eat before all the food's gone, Molly's voice called from the other end of the room, interrupting Tonks's admonishment of her god-awful name. She sighed and turned towards the stove, leaving the two men sneering in her wake. Hydrate or dihydrate? A passage of time. Two helpings of Molly's meatballs later, all thoughts of exactly how Remus Lupin seemed to know who she was had blissfully disappeared. She'd spent most of the time she wasn't eating entertaining the youngest Weasley with various transformations. Ginny's favorite had been the pig snout, but Tonks was always partial to the beak that bore a striking resemblance to Snape. As the night had wound down, she had had to report to work the next morning, far too early for her liking. Tonks found herself dutifully saying goodbye to Molly and Sirius and heading down the hallway towards the door. Unfortunately, the troll leg umbrella stand had decided to have the last laugh of the night, however, and Tonks was once again hurtling towards the door. The crash landing she'd instinctively braced herself for never came. Instead, a strong hand grabbed her upper arm and pulled her back up to safety. First encounter with this monstrosity? An amused voice came from behind her. Tonks let out a breath she didn't know she was holding as she realized she was pressed against her rescuer's chest. She pulled away quickly, turning to see, as she'd expected by this point, that Remus had been the one to stop her fall. Not exactly. Tonks avoided his gaze. Thanks, though. Better be on my way. Scrimmager doesn't like employees who oversleep. Sorry, I was trying to catch you on your way out. Well, you managed that quite handily. Her eyes flickered to the umbrella stand. Right. Anyway, Mad Eye's got shifts scheduled for monitoring the Knots and the Malfoys next week. Wanted me to make sure you got a copy. Remus handed her a piece of paper with Mad Eye's signature scrawl on both sides. Don't worry, it's charmed so only Order members can read it. Thanks. Tonks scanned the page, pausing when she saw their names together for Tuesday next. She folded the piece of paper haphazardly and stuffed it in her pocket before heading towards the door. Remus following in her stead. I guess I'll see you on Tuesday then. She pulled the door open and headed down the front stairs. Good night. Good night, Nymphadora, he called from the doorway. She'd made it to the last step before the sound of her horrendous name on his lips caused her to trip. Don't call me Nymphadora! Her words hung heavily in the hot summer air, but when she turned to see if he'd heard them, she found the door shut, number 12 Grimmauld Place, fading from view. The Git. A passage of time. Check on you guys. Nice. A passage of time. The days in the lead up to Tuesday dragged on minute by minute, yet were simultaneously a blur, events bleeding over into each other in her mind like watercolors on a canvas. Tonks wasn't exactly sure why she had been waiting in anticipation for her first real work for the Order to roll around. She'd already done plenty of intel work for them within the Ministry. Perhaps it was the chance to put those 3 years of training to work for the type of cause she'd fantasized about before leaving Hogwarts. Fighting the good fight. Tonks unfolded the piece of paper listing the Order's shifts for that week, ignoring how worn its edges had become living in her pocket since she'd received it. Whatever it was that had her staring at the clock on the wall above her desk, it certainly had nothing to do with the man's name written next to hers. After what seemed like an eternity, the clock struck 5, and Tonks was apparating back to her flat to change footwear. The more practical, the better when it came to anything that required stealth and certain umbrella stands before arriving at Grimmauld Place. The smell of what she could only assume to be shepherd's pie wafted down the hallway, where she expertly avoided any major catastrophes. Tonks! Molly called from where she stood over the stove. "You're here early." "I was hoping I might snag a bite to eat," she replied, pulling out a chair. "Remus and I have a long night ahead of us." "Remus is on duty tonight." Molly flicked her wand at the pot on the stove, leaving the potatoes to mash themselves before turning around. "I'll have to make sure he gets something to eat. He was looking rather pale this morning." "Is he all right?" Tonks asked, concerned. "I'm sure he'll say he's fine, as usual. Honestly, the full moon was only Sunday night. Alistair should have known better." Full moon? At that, the kettle whistled, and two tall redheads stumbled into the kitchen, presumably at the smell of food. Tonks busied herself with making tea while Molly shooed the boys out to alert everyone else that dinner was ready. Steaming mug in hand, she reclaimed her seat at the table before the rest of the pack stumbled in. Full moon. She thought back to a week or so earlier when Mad Eye had been listing out the order members to her. Had he mentioned anyone being a werewolf? Tonks took a sip from her mug, trying to remember. Mad Eye had mentioned something about someone and not to make a big deal of it, but it had also been 5:30 in the morning when this conversation had occurred. Mad Eye was convinced Death Eaters had to sleep sometime, and that time being the wee hours of the morning, and thus made all his house calls accordingly. So there was a fair chance her sleep-addled brain had heard the words werewolf and don't worry and went promptly back to sleep. She mulled the situation over as the rest of Grimald Place's inhabitants filled into the kitchen. Her mum had mentioned once, after a particularly nasty headline splashed across the Daily Prophet's front page had scared her 9-year-old self senseless, that one of Sirius's friends was a werewolf. So they couldn't be all that bad, could they? Tonks looked over the rim of her steaming mug to where Remus stood speaking with Arthur. Could he be that friend? No. She shook her head. She would have remembered something like that. She didn't even know, or remember, rather, who he was. Dinner passed uneventfully, with only a few questions from Fred and George about her metamorphosis abilities. Apparent research for their joke shop, while she continued to ponder the identity of one Remus Lupin. She found him waiting for her near the door promptly at 7 o'clock, their scheduled departure time. "Watcher," she greeted him. "Ready?" he asked, giving her a once-over. She nodded, taking note of what she presumed to be Mad Eye's invisibility cloak draped across his arm. "Right. We'll apparate from the park down the street to a few blocks from the Knott's family home. From there, we'll take the invisibility cloak and station ourselves under the old walnut tree at the corner of their property. We've got word they're having some sort of meeting there tonight, and Dumbledore wants to know who's in attendance." Tonks nodded once more. The plan seemed simple enough. "Lead the way." She motioned towards the door, taking extra care not to trip over the door frame. It was too early in the evening for the heat of the day to fully lift, and the hot air encased them as they made their way to the end of the road. She stopped in the small patch of trees she had apparated into earlier. "Take my arm," said Remus. She did as she was told, ignoring the small rush of warmth she felt as her fingers wrapped around the soft cotton of his shirt sleeve. With a twist and a crack, they were gone, reappearing in a dusty alleyway. Where are we?" Tonks asked, brushing the dust off her t-shirt. "Just outside Bristol. According to Kingsley's reconnaissance, the Knott's residence should be about a mile down the road here." He pointed to the road the alleyway opened up to. "And then a quarter of a mile down the first road on the right." "A nice evening summer stroll, then?" Tonks suggested jokingly. Exactly. Remus checked his watch. Except, unlike most nice evening summer strolls, this one won't involve any pleasant conversation, since we'll be stuck under this. He handed her one end of the invisibility cloak. Shall we? Tonks sighed dramatically. Oh, all right. You owe me a pleasant conversation, though. Gladly, Remus smiled. Seemingly, Tonks noticed for the first time without a threat of breaking into laughter. They covered themselves with the invisibility cloak and headed out of the alleyway and down the road. It wasn't exactly, well, roomy, Tonks thought, as her arm brushed against Remus's once again. As before, she refused to acknowledge the tingling sensation that was the result, attributing it to nerves about their mission. Just when she thought she'd finally, truly ignored it, though, Tonks felt a warm hand on her shoulder, guiding her towards the road they were meant to turn down. What was wrong with her? Tonks mentally berated herself. She didn't even know who he was, though he obviously seemed to know her. Really, yet he was making her feel like she had in her 5th year whenever Henry Goldsmith had so much as looked at her. Whatever it was, it would have to wait, as Tonks could see the large walnut tree, an even larger abode looming in the distance. When they reached their destination, Remus cast a concealment charm on the area around the tree before removing the invisibility cloak from them. So we don't have to stay under that stuffy blanket all night, he explained. Tonks nodded and cast a silencing charm around the area in response. So I can get that pleasant conversation you owe me? She smirked. We've got a long night ahead of us, and I've got questions for you. Remus raised an eyebrow. Questions? Yes. It had just occurred to her that perhaps the best way to find out who Remus was, whether or not he was a werewolf, and just how he knew who she was when she had no recollection of him, was just to ask. Problem? Depends on the question. He pulled a small piece of fabric from his pocket, and with the tap of his wand, it had grown into a large blanket. Remus placed it on the ground next to the tree and motioned for her to join him. If it's does Sirius chase his tail when he's a dog, the answer is yes, absolutely, and are you surprised? Tonks let out a puff of laughter as she sat down. But if it's what's your deepest, darkest secret, then I may not be able to answer. After all, that's what secrets are for, isn't it? To be, well, secret? Yeah, I suppose, she cracked a smile, fighting very hard not to start laughing. Does he really chase his tail? Occasionally, when he's bored, which seems to be all the time lately. Remus trailed off. Tonks pulled her knees up under her chin. Though once in 6th year, I believe, he chased a cat through the streets of Hogsmeade, only to turn the corner and find Minerva McGonagall looking rather winded. The dam holding back Tonks's laughter burst, as did Remus's attempts to keep a straight face. Did she know it was him? Tonks wiped a tear from her eye as she tried to catch her breath. Not a clue, Remus replied. He too was trying to slow his breathing. Well, at least not until he had the audacity to ask how her trip to Hogsmeade was the next morning. He smiled wistfully, gaze unfocused, as if he were reliving the memory. That answer all your questions? He asked hopefully. Not quite. Tonks stopped abruptly at the feel of Remus's hand on her forearm. Her breath hitched as she followed the incline of his head to the stretch of lawn to their right. 3 figures were hastily approaching the front entrance. Is that Lucius, Narcissa, and Draco Malfoy? Yes, I believe so. Tonks swallowed, just what she would like to do to her good for nothing aunt and your mother's sister, correct? Unfortunately, she sighed. Though Mum was blasted off the family tree long ago. Remus nodded in support. They remained silent after that, hoping for more guests to arrive. Tonks kept her knees pulled up to her chest, contemplating just what actually was go contemplating just what she actually was going to tell Remus. She supposed it would be a tad insensitive just to come out and ask, "Are you a werewolf because Molly mentioned you might be?" No, that wouldn't do. And just why did he seem to have a full account of her playing Quidditch with Sirius and James Potter? It was years ago. She barely even remembered it. And it wasn't as if he had even been there. Tonks's thoughts drifted off, recounting what her plan of attack was for the mountain of paperwork on her desk, contemplating whether tomorrow, Wednesday, was a blonde or a blue hair type of day, and just skirting around the edges of why her stomach had decided to turn tingly whenever Remus touched her. She watched the sky warm from faded blue to light pink and yellow, which then turned melted turn which then in turn melted into an orangey red, and finally deepened into a blue black that shone with stars. It reminded her of those blissful last days at Hogwarts each year, when she would sit out on the grass around the lake, basking in the summer air and beautiful sunset, not a care in the world. Had Sirius done the same with his friends? Tonks wondered. And had Remus been among them? A rumbling noise finally pulled her back to reality. Hungry? Remus asked. Hungry? She heard the rumbling noise again, this time realizing it was her own stomach. Merlin, this was embarrassing. Seems like it, she replied nonchalantly, trying to mask the pink creeping up in her cheeks. Remus reached into his pocket and pulled out something in a yellow wrapper. You're in luck, he said. I just so happen to find it rather useful to always keep some chocolate about my person. Their fingers brushed as Remus handed her sorry. Their fingers brushed as Remus handed her the bar of chocolate. When Tonks went to unwrap it, though, she froze. Honeybees? She stammered. Not exactly the top shelf at Honeydukes, I know. Remus seemed to shrink into himself a bit. It's better than nothing, though, I suppose. He shifted his eyes toward the ground while Tonks continued to stare at the yellow rectangle. I I was convinced I was the only one who even liked Hunnelby's chocolate. When I was in school, the old shopkeeper at Honeydukes used to joke that I was the only reason he kept it in stock. Her friends had always preferred the pink and purple Goldenia or the bright orange Bulveries. It had been a bit of a joke at the time, how Tonks had a thing for Hunnelbees and obviously didn't know anything about good chocolate, but it had been her favorite since she was a kid. She couldn't remember why exactly. That's just the way it had been, and she'd stuck to it. Remus perked up and looked at her with a smile. Really? Tonks pulled the paper aside. Yeah, it's always been my favorite. She stopped. Underneath the wrapping lay the signature Hunnelbee's squares, adorned with individual scripted H's. And one of those squares had been broken neatly in half, leaving a triangle in its place. Her eyes slowly traveled from the chocolate to Remus once more. It was You're the one. You? Flashback. Nymphadora Tonks found herself transported back to her childhood home. She had come this close to beating Sirius and his friend at Quidditch, but she'd been distracted by a bright orange butterfly and had crashed straight into their makeshift goalposts. The wind was knocked out of her when she hit the ground, and she held back the tears that were threatening to escape, because tears meant her mother, and that meant no more Quidditch. You all right? Sirius asked concernedly, eyes searching in the distance for a fuming Andromeda. That was quite a fall you took there, said James. Too bad it came just as I scored for me and Padfoot. Tonks groaned as she sat up. No, I was so close. A tall boy with light brown hair and a book in his hand approached them. He pulled something from his pocket and knelt down beside her, holding out his hand. Eat. You'll feel better. He smiled as she took the yellow bar from his hand. Chocolate? She asked, inspecting the wrapper. He nodded. Is it your favorite? James and Sirius snorted. The girl sat at their feet had no idea. Definitely, he grinned. Tonks seemed satisfied with her inspection, unwrapping the chocolate and popping a piece into her mouth. Don't let him fool you, Sirius scoffed. Mooney's the one and only person who actually eats Hunnlebees. Surprised they can survive on his business alone. Tonks looked up at her cousin in disbelief. This chocolate was good. And why was he being so mean to the boy that gave it to her? Well, if it's... She paused, looking up at the boy for help. Remus, he whispered. Well, if it's Remus's favorite, then it's my favorite too. Tonks crossed her arms defiantly, looking proud of herself. Whatever you say, Nymphadora, Sirius smirked knowingly. Don't call me... Your aunt's staring at us rather suspiciously through the kitchen window, Padfoot. We'd better get back inside, he said quickly. James eyed the house warily. And I'd like a slice of that birthday cake. Sirius nodded in agreement and took off, determined not to let anyone get a slice of his own cake before he did. James took off after him, leaving Tonks and Remus behind. Tonks looked up at Remus, still kneeling in front of her, as she broke off another piece of chocolate. Why are your friends so mean to you about the chocolate you like? She asked innocently. They're just jealous of me because I'm different. Remus eyed her bubblegum pink hair. Just like I bet your friends are jealous that you can turn your hair fun colors. Tonks smiled. You know what else they're mean to me about? He asked. What? Well, he took the chocolate bar from her hand. I like to break off my pieces of chocolate like this. Remus broke one of the small squares in half, leaving a triangle in its place. Instead of eating the whole piece at once. Tonks looked up at him inquisitively. Why? She asked, a hint of skepticism in her voice. Makes it last longer, he shrugged. And for some reason, it really bothers Sirius, so I figure I ought to keep doing it. Tonks laughed and took back the bar of chocolate, breaking off a piece just like Remus had. I'll do it too then, she smiled, as payback for beating me at Quidditch. Remus chuckled and stood up, offering his hand to help Tonks off the ground. She grabbed her broom and they headed inside, Tonks eager to get her hands on a piece of the cake that had been tempting her all day long. End of flashback. It was... You are the one. You? Remus raised an eyebrow in confusion. Sorry? You're the one who gave me the chocolate. The memory had hit her like an oncoming train. He was the same boy, the same friend of Sirius's, who had been kind and given her that bar of chocolate. The same boy who had been the reason a 9 year old she'd start the reason at 9 years old she'd started exclusively asking for honeybees, much to her mum's chagrin, and breaking it off into little triangles. He, Remus Lupin, was the same boy who'd later that night told her numerous stories of the adventures of a wolf, a rat, a dog, and a stag, marauding through the woods at night, looking for trouble, but saving the day in the end. Why, yes, I did give you that chocolate just now. He still looked confused. You were there for Sirius's birthday. She paused, questioning her own memory. And you gave me this chocolate, which is the only kind I've eaten ever since. Those stories, they were about you. It all made sense now. Sirius was the dog, and he was the wolf. Of course, he was a werewolf. A knowing glint in Remus's eyes confirmed that she was correct, but he remained mute on the subject. And her eyes widened in realization. You're the boy I fancied in you're the boy I fancied in the only way a small child can, for months, no, years later. She swallowed a lump in her throat. She didn't say that out loud. Are you all right? Remus asked, concerned by her sudden lack for words. I I forgot you existed. A look of relief crossed Remus's face. As I mentioned the other night, I'm afraid I'm rather forgettable. He grinned cheekily. No offense taken. Tonks covered her face in her hands, tossing the chocolate bar aside, and groaned, wishing the ground below her would swallow her whole. Though, if I may ask, what did finally cause you to remember who I was? The triangles, she sighed, lifting her head. I've broken my chocolate into bits like that since I was a kid. Because of you. Tonks, once again, was fighting the rising heat in her cheeks, hoping that Remus took it as pure embarrassment over forgetting someone rather than the other emotions rolling inside of her. Uh, yeah, I suppose that is rather unusual. Remus picked up the chocolate bar, broke off another piece, and held it out to her. Eat. You'll feel better. Tonks smiled wearily as she accepted his offering. You told me that before. I haven't been wrong about it yet. A soft smile graced his lips before turning into a laugh. Tonks continued nibbling on the chocolate, and after another half an hour of no new arrivals, they decided to call it quits, removing the charms they'd placed and slipping under the invisibility cloak once more. They headed back to where they had apparated earlier, Tonks mentally cursing herself. How could she forget him? The cause of the rush of heat every time they touched had become blatantly clear. She had come face to face with her childhood crush, and inexplicably, those feelings had never seemed to quite go away. No, she thought as she apparated back to Grimmauld Place. I'm an adult. Those feelings aren't real. They're just repressed, leftover childhood memories. That's all. By the time they reached the front door of number 12, she'd almost convinced herself it was true. She followed Remus into the empty kitchen where he drafted up a report of the night's events. Unfortunately, the Malfoys' presence at the Knots could easily be explained away as inviting some friends over for a nice dinner. He handed her a quill and she signed her name next to his, affirming the report's contents. Well, I'd say tonight was uneventful, but I'm afraid that would be understating it on my part, Tonks joked. Either way, I'm afraid I still better be going, seeing as it's far past my bedtime. She made it as far as the entryway. Wait, before you go, Remus came up behind her. He muttered what sounded like Accio under his breath, and sure enough, a distinctly yellow shape whizzed down the stairs and into his hand. Since you seem to like it so much, he held out an unopened Hunnelbee's chocolate bar. Tonks smiled sheepishly, feeling both flattered and once again humiliatingly embarrassed. Should I be concerned? She asked playfully, regaining her composure. Are you running a secret chocolate trade on the black market with dung, and that's why you've got such an innumerable supply? A marauder never gives up his secrets, especially to an R. Remus bit his lip, holding back a smile, and Tonks's heart skipped a beat. We always get the bad guys in the end, you know. You'll spill sooner or later. I do rather hope it's later then, seeing as it's apparently past your bedtime. He smirked, pushing the chocolate bar into her hand and steering her towards the door. Good night, Nymphadora. For some reason, she couldn't bring herself to respond in her usual fashion. He had given her chocolate, and it was the least she could do. Good night, Remus, Tonks called behind her. She took a deep breath and stepped out once more into the warm summer air. Her earlier questions now answered, and far more new ones in their place. The end. Hooray! I love that story a lot. Um, those are two characters that you don't get to see interacting with each other. So it was very cute. I liked it. I liked it a lot. Thank you so much for sending that in. We are going to keep doing these. So please send in your submissions. They need to be 5,000 words or less. And we are looking for stuff like this that's like wholesome and sweet. We're looking for cracky, silly, insane stuff. It has to be written by you. So send us your original works, 5,000 words or less. And we are just going to keep doing these Storytime live streams. Make sure to follow us on Twitter and get notifications sent to your phone so that you know when we are doing our next Storytime live stream. I'm hoping to convince Kim to do the next one. So hypothetically, we will see you sometime this weekend. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you so much to the author for sending this story in. I loved it a lot. And bye. Bye. Bye.